For most people, the history of Russia-Ukraine starts roughly in February of 2022, of course, and the narrative goes something like this. The peaceful democracy in Ukraine was the victim of a completely unprovoked attack by authoritarian dictator Vladimir Putin. If Putin's allowed to take Ukraine, he's going to march across Europe. This new Hitler must be stopped, and we must stand up for democracy over tyranny. What's wrong with that narrative, and when did this actually start?
Well, the first part of it that's wrong is that it started in 22. The other part that's wrong is that it was unprovoked. And then the third part that's wrong is that it represents something like step one in the recreation of the old Russian Empire or the Soviet Empire. None of those three things are right. The part about Putin being an evil dictator is sort of right. I mean, he's an autocrat and a strong man. He's not exactly a dictator, but he's what'd you call him, like an El Presidente? You know what I mean? Mirrored sunglasses and a sash type, like Colonel Gaddafi or something. So, he's no kind of hero. Which, let's just start with that for a second. In the battle days of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, there literally were American communists who favored the USSR because they were communists. And so they sided with Russia against the United States. The dirty rats. But there's just nothing like that in America now. I don't even think as far as I know, anyway, as far as I've seen in any media, I don't even think among Russian expats in America is there some kind of big pro-Putinist movement, right? I'm sure they love their home country fine. But remember the fake scandal about Tony Hinchcliffe making a joke at Madison Square Garden? And then they pretended that instead of Madison Square Garden being literally the single most important entertainment venue in the most important city in the world, that the last time it was used was in 1939 when the German-American Bund showed up to rally for Hitler. Well, there is no Russian-American Bund. There's just not. I mean, first of all, as stupid as that is, there's nothing even like that on behalf of Russia in America. And when the war party says, oh, you just love Putin, or how much is Putin paying you, or these are Putin talking points and whatever, that's completely stupid. It doesn't make any sense at all. If they were criticizing real communists back in the 70s or something, then there would at least be the possibility of a kernel of truth to it. Maybe they are anti-American traitors, and maybe they're not, but at least there's an open question there. But what does a Texan and a Ron Paul guy and a libertarian and an American care about Russia? Nothing. I've never been there. I don't speak the language. I don't give a damn about Russia. The book is not about Russia. The book is about what America did to corner the Russians and put them in the position to launch this war, deciding that they had no choice but to go now because otherwise they're going to have to go later when it would be more difficult.
Well, yeah,
that's the bottom line of it, is that Joe Biden is a lousy president, and so's the presidents before him too. And that's essentially the sum of it all, is they provoked the attack. Not that Kiev did, although they played their role, but America is the superpower. And the subtitle is how Washington started the new Cold War with Russia and the catastrophe in Ukraine. So the book is not saying that the war is justified or that Ukraine had it coming. It's that America had said to Ukraine, let's you and him fight. And that's the catastrophe that's taking place right now.
Yeah, if you could give us a little bit of that history of how this happened, because this is not something that I would say everyone who watches mainstream media knows much about at all. You know, they get those talking points, and if you're against it, then you're pro-Putin or whatever. So you got to be in favor of democracy and all that. But what has the U.S. been doing? Like, how far back does this go, actually?
Well, the book begins with the end of the last Cold War and the H.W. Bush Senior administration taking full advantage, lying through their teeth to the Soviets and then the Russians about what their plans were and how they were pursuing them. And then essentially seeking to not only continue American dominance through NATO in Europe, but to spread the NATO alliance and American military dominance into Eastern Europe and right up to Russia's border. And in doing so, they knew all along, never mind our heroes like Ron Paul or Pat Buchanan, people who, Ted Galen Carpenter, and people who knew all along, and, hardcore libertarians who warned, or in Pat's case, a paleoconservative, who warned against this stuff. But you had all of the brightest lights at the Council on Foreign Relations. You had all of the leaders of the American foreign policy establishment. So we should not be doing this. Why would we pick a fight with the Russians now? And the people who were the expanders said, one, don't worry about it. It's not against Russia. And we'll just tell them 100 times, this isn't against you. And then we'll just do it anyway. And if they react, well, we always have NATO. So built into the thing from the very beginning was this self-fulfilling prophecy. And not just that, but they woke up in the morning and said, time to go fulfill that self-fulfilling prophecy of mine, and went and did it anyway, quite deliberately. And they knew what was going to happen, and they did it anyway. And that's through the Bush, and especially the Bill Clinton, W. Bush, and Barack Obama years. Although Donald Trump played his role as well, mostly because he didn't have the control over his government's Russia policy for 4 years while he was in there last time. But that's essentially the sum of it. Was after the end of the last Cold War, instead of being a good sport, the Americans were the bullies. And of course, they tell themselves that they're the heroes and the other guys are the bullies. And whenever anybody does anything, that's like Hitler being a bully, and you have to be like Churchill and FDR and stand up to him. And they all, and I really regret this. It almost sounds like I'm arguing for their innocence in a way. Like when I call W. Bush a dummy, people get mad and say, like, I'm letting him off the hook. But the thing is, I think that they can be dummies and also very culpable for the deliberate decisions that they make with their will and with their pens at the same time. But I think it's so obvious now. I just see it so much. It's so obvious that the people in charge, they actually don't know anything about it. And so that's why they speak only in these ridiculous historical analogies, and worse, schoolyard analogies. That's all they ever say is, look, this is Hitler versus FDR and we're FDR, or there's a bully on the playground and everybody knows you have to punch the bully in the nose, which these are all dorks, by the way, right? None of these guys are actual good guy, macho, tough guys who face down the bully on the playground. They're all the dorks that needed protecting from the bully, is who they are, all of them. And then they all repeat this, just these inane sort of like figures of speech. Like imagine Ross Perot going, well, we have to go to war because we're like a cat in a room full of rocking chairs and got a long tail. Well, hang on now. Are you going to actually explain what the hell you mean by that? Like, you're really just going to sit here and shout Hitler and Churchill at me? And that's enough to do this? And the answer is yeah, because they're idiots. And that's the best that they can do. And do they even know anything about World War II? No. All they know is Hitler was the bad guy and Churchill and FDR stood up to him. Not like those wimps who didn't want to, right? And like, that's all that they know. And so they say it every day of the week. They say it. All of them. The whole war party. That's all they say. Hitler, Churchill, bully, playground. Over and over and over again.
Well, for the most part, it works though, right? I mean, the American people go along with it. We've continued this policy. So I guess their incentive is to just keep invoking Hitler, right?
Well, there's a lot of that. I mean, Americans do. That's why it's effective propaganda. That's why they keep using it, because it works on people. And, I learned as a kid that, it says in the Bible that the creator of the universe says you're not allowed to kill each other. That's like that's the 10 Commandments before Jesus even arrived. He said you're not allowed to kill each other. Right. But, there's a loophole. See, as long as you're wearing green, and your heroic government sends you to fight the Wehrmacht in the fields of France, well, of course, God approves of that. What are you supposed to do? Just let Hitler conquer the world? Of course, that's a giant asterisk on thou shalt not kill. When you're fighting for your country, it's okay. And since the enemy is not Kim or Ho or even Khrushchev, the enemy is always Hitler. The enemy's not even Tojo. The enemy is Hitler, always. And therefore, the war is always justified. After all, as everyone knows, any one of us would be obligated to murder even baby Hitler if we could go back in time and murder him as a baby, which is, of course, their excuse for murdering Palestinians now. Like all these Palestinian babies are all little Hitlers, too. And they're just going back in time and saving the world from them, which is a ridiculous and hollow excuse. But once people are married to that proposition, that only America is Superman and only America can stop Hitler and all of our adversaries are Hitler, well, then, yeah, you wrote yourself a blank check for permanent war. Except that blank check, of course, there is a limit on how much money that they can print and they can spend. Right now, the biggest portion of the budget is just paying interest on the national debt, more than the actual empire's itself's budget, the military budget itself. It's amazing. And so there is a hard limit on it, but in their imagination, they're always the good guy. They're always the hero. They're always Superman, and the enemy's always Lex Luthor, and they're always justified. And again, it sounds like I'm acquitting them because I'm saying that their motives are good, but they sort of kind of are. I mean, they're very compromised, and yes, they're ruthless, and yes, they're willing to do this and that, and they make a lot of money and buy nice houses to live in while they're at it, and all of these things. But at the end of the day, and well, the breakfast, lunch, and dinner, they tell themselves that they're right. And even any compromises that they have to make and evil acts that they have to commit is all for the greater good, ultimately. You know, maybe we have to get rid, maybe we have to support Al-Qaeda in Syria, but ultimately we got to stop those Shiites. And so it's all like, you know, based on these rationalizations that they're doing the right thing. And it's sort of, you know, they're like begging the question, right? It's, since they know that what they're doing is right, always, because they're the ones doing it, then they can always come up with a retroactive justification for what it is. They just have to make it up. Well, somehow the Ayatollah is worse than bin Laden, even though it wasn't the Ayatollah that knocked our towers down. That was bin Laden that did that. But anyway, no, we still hate the Ayatollah more because Israel says so or whatever garbage. And they just rationalize it and justify it.
You see, I always look at these people as evil people with evil intentions, but you're kind of saying that they actually do have good intentions. Do you believe that these people in power actually have good intentions?
Yeah, I mean, it's both, right? That's the whole thing of it. I mean, even Janet Reno, the FBI told Janet Reno, we got to go save those babies. And then they attacked the church full of babies and killed them. Now, the FBI, they were just pissed. But the attorney general who gave them the order, she thought she was doing the right thing. They put her in the position. They said, you're not going to let him continue to beat these babies, are you? We have to stop him from doing that. So she killed them because she thought she was telling the FBI to go and save the babies, not to barbecue them all to death. But she's a Democrat, and that's how Democrats are. So, like, was that a horrible, evil act for her to do? Yes. It's the worst thing in the world she could have done. But she's also a stupid idiot who believed horrible liars and took their word when they lied to her and took their word that they knew that they were going to be very careful about what they were going to do and they were going to save the women and the children. And so I think, you know, of course, it's always a giant mix. Look at how obviously tight, but somewhat like a medium-sized group of absolute liars and foreign agents lied us into war with Iraq. But then look at the hundreds of thousands or millions of people even who believed what they said and really thought that, yeah, we're going to go save the Middle East. We're going to give them a democracy. We're going to protect America from getting attacked from chemical weapons. We got to stop that Saddam Hussein right now. And you had people like that in the government too, right? Like, there are a lot of people in the government who were lying, but there were a lot of people who believed it. There are a lot of people, of course, you know, it's all social psychology. We all believe this, right, guys? And you see this happen over and over again. You know, they call it the current thing. We see it, you know, the way it affects Twitter and the masses. It's the same thing within the establishment too. This is a preemptive attack. We have to stop Iraq from giving weapons to terrorists. And then enough people believe that crap that then now you're kind of a dork and maybe a hippie and a liberal and a commie and a homo if you don't believe it too. So now it's a question of like, whose side are you on? And, I don't know if people remember this is 25 years ago, but it's yesterday to me. South Park's episode about Iraq War II didn't even have Saddam Hussein in it, I don't think at all. And he was a recurring character on South Park at that time. But the whole question of whether we should attack Iraq or not on South Park was, do you like country or do you like rock and roll? If you then you support the war. And if you like rock and roll, then you're against it. And if you lean right, then you support the war. And if you lean left, you're against it. This is just as simple as that. Whose side are you on? And it's the perfect caricature because the right wingers are saying, you dumb liberal commie hippies, you don't want to protect America from the evil enemy. And then the liberals are saying, you dummy, Saddam didn't do 9/11. It was the other, the thing. But they're both just talking past each other. And it's simply a question like, what's your favorite radio station? That's how you know whether you support invading Iraq or not. Is, do you live in town or do you live in the country, right? Or just how far, which suburb do you live in, and how does that suburb feel about it? That's all it comes down to. I was a cab driver at the time during Iraq War II. And all of the working and lower class people in the town knew better. And all of the upper class people were for it. Right? All the people with the best educations, all the dentists and lawyers and doctors and professional daytime government employees and university professors and whatever, they all knew that we have to do this. They knew we had to do this. Every bartender and Tuesday drunk and little old lady with no, living off her pension or whatever, all these people knew it was a lie. All these people could see right through it because they had no feeling of vested interest in it. They had no feeling they were going to be judged by their peers for knowing better. And so they weren't like cornered by ridiculous social incentives into being warmongers. So they weren't. And so I hate to say it, but that is how it goes. And listen to Joe Biden. Do I ever tell you about that time I faced down the bully at the swimming pool? Like, people make fun of that because he's talking about his leg hair. And it turns out there really was a bully named Corn Pop in the neighborhood. Apparently, like that, there was some truth to that story. I don't know if Biden really faced the guy down or not. Probably he embellished maybe somebody else's story. Somebody else faced down Corn Pop. But Joe Biden learned a lesson that day that you got to always face down Corn Pop. And these guys are morons, all of them. And so, there's a lot of evil in it. There's a lot of money making. There's a lot of corruption and a lot of, like I say, there's they got to all have nice places to live, don't they? So they can get good rest at night so they can go monger more war in the morning. So, yeah, they bought a new mansion with that giant, contract that they made in between times when their party was in power. I mean, look at who runs Biden's government right now. It's the West Exec Advisors. These are all the people who went to go and make millions for 4 years while Donald Trump was the president. And now they're back again. So yeah, of course, the whole thing is riddled with conflicts and all that. But on the other hand, all this caricature of this pure blood drinking evil and come on, we're all just psychopathic serial killers and we love murdering people for evil lucre or what, filthy wealth, greedy thing. Nah, why do they need to be like that? I have a friend who hates Star Wars because he says, Americans will never recognize the empire unless the president is shooting lightning out of his hands and is wearing this dark cloak and declaring himself the embodiment of evil in the universe. Otherwise, apparently it's perfectly fine that we just go on doing the things that we do. You know what I mean? So who needs the caricature? This is what we got. This is evil is as evil does. You know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So I was wondering, we can have the best of intentions or think that there's rational reasons for the things that we do. So what about as far as Russia's concerned with Ukraine? Was there actual reasonable threat of danger for Russia that they needed to put down? And did they have other options other than starting this war? Is it something that they truly felt they had to do?
Yes, on both. Clearly, the Americans were compromising their security by their repeated insistence on bringing Ukraine into NATO. And Bush started it in 2008 against all the best advice, not just of the establishment, but his own government, his own National Security Council, his own embassy staff in Moscow, and apparently his own Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense. We know that Burns, who's our current CIA director, who was the ambassador to Moscow at the time, he said that he was sure that, or at least he thought that Rice agreed with him. And we know that Secretary Gates agreed with him. She was the Secretary of State. Gates was the Secretary of Defense, and he slammed Bush in his second memoir, where he says this was vast overreach and an absolutely terrible decision that he made to offer this sort of half membership action plan to Ukraine and Georgia in 2008. And why did he do it? Burns says for legacy building, for his own stupid reasons. He did it because he was a giant failure. He was going down in history as the worst president ever. Iraq War II was supposed to be his legacy. It was a disaster. He tried to privatize Social Security and put all the money in the stock market bubble. That would have been great, but they wouldn't let him do that either. So what was his legacy? Nothing but filth, nothing but torturing people to death and lying us into war for Israel. And so instead, he said, well, I know what I'll do. I'll make a big move in Eastern Europe. And this move, it'll be big. And I'll go down in history as the man who made a big decision. Because, again, like, he's trying to do what he thinks is right, first for himself, and secondly for, like, spreading American power and democracy and all of this stuff, as he always said. It's always full of this self-righteousness. And then if there's problems that come from it, well, that's somebody else will deal with that. He's gone. That was his last year in power. He's out. And now it's somebody else's problem. Obama made things worse by overthrowing the government in Kiev. Bush did it in 2004, and then Obama did it again in 2014. And that's what really started the war in the East in 2014 and caused the loss of Crimea back to Russia. And then forget Trump for a minute because it's basically mostly a Russiagate conversation there, but he was not in charge of his own Russia policy for 4 years.
Well, I want to ask you about Russiagate, though. I mean,
well, get back to that in 1 second, though.
Yeah.
But then on the security question, Joe Biden came in determined to push. And look, this goes back to this whole stupid FDR and Hitler thing. Is Putin is saying, listen, man, I have serious security concerns. And Biden is going, you're just paranoid. All we're doing is defensive things. And if you think that that's a problem, well, that's your problem. And in fact, Ukraine, we reaffirm our promise to bring you into NATO. State Department issued a giant memorandum about it. And the Defense Department said, that's right, we want to double down on integrating your military forces into ours, interoperability, so that if NATO does ever go to war with Russia, you'll essentially be a de facto member of NATO and fighting in our army, in our combined army against the Russian Federation. And so and then Bush had also done missile defense, which Obama expanded and Trump continued and Biden continued, which is putting these anti-ballistic missile systems in Romania and Poland. And it's complicated, but the big deal here is they're dual-use launchers. And you can fire a Tomahawk cruise missile, which can be tipped with an H-bomb. And now that the INF treaty is torn up, Donald Trump tore it up. Now that the INF treaty is torn up, they could put hydrogen bombs on Tomahawk cruise missiles, and they could put so-called anti-ballistic missile launchers right there in Kharkiv, just a couple of 100 miles from Moscow, 300 miles from Moscow. And of course, also, you have the question of the unsettled border in Crimea, where Ukraine and Russia both claim it, but Russia owns it now, de facto, de jure. They are on top of it with their soldiers standing there, their Marines. Ukraine can't take it from them, but if they tried, and then as Putin put it in a couple of different statements before the war, if Ukraine attacked Crimea with the intent to so-called liberate it from Russian occupation, but the Russians consider it their territory, and they then defend their territory, then NATO would take that as a Russian attack and aggression against Ukraine. And at that point, that could lead to Article 5 being invoked and a general war between NATO and the Russian Federation. And he discussed this in a back and forth with a French reporter. And he says, listen, lady, do you want war between Russia and France? Because that's what we're talking about could happen here over Crimea. That's why it says, and they talk about waiving this. That's why it says in the treaty, you can't join our alliance unless you have settled borders. You can't have an ongoing border dispute and then join our alliance and drag us into your ongoing border dispute. That's crazy. They're talking about, well, that is the law, but we'd have to just change that. What? And so look, there's a British professor who wrote a thing called Now or Never. And he's saying essentially Putin decided, well, I'm going to war with Ukraine now, or I'm going to war with Ukraine later. I might as well do it now when it'll be easier than later when it's harder. Because America's just pouring more and more weapons in, doing more and more to standardize their military forces as part of ours and the rest. And so might as well do it now instead of then. And I think he did. You asked, and I think he did have other alternatives. Obvious ones include he could have just shut off all the gas to Europe and taken the economic hit and done everything he could to open up trade in the East at the same time. But in the winter, November, December of 21, he could have shut off all the gas and said, "You think I'm playing?" That might have had a real effect. That might have had that might have convinced the Germans to convince the Americans to sit down at the table and see if we can solve this. They didn't try that. They could have also just obstructed all UN Security Council business. They have a veto on the UN Security Council. They could have just said, we're not going to let the UN Security Council move until you put a real peacekeeping force on the ground there and implement the Minsk II agreement that they had already signed. The UN Security Council had already rubber stamped back in 2015. And he could have insisted on that. And frankly, he could have just put unarmed peacekeepers. He could have invaded with unarmed men to just go and stand around, or like give them pistols, whatever, give them blue helmets and pistols and just go stand there on the line. And, without a massive invading force, but like essentially as disobedience, right? And this sounds crazy to a lot of people, but in the Baltics, I think especially in Lithuania, this is actually how they expelled the Soviet troops in 1991. A giant mob of people singing songs forced them out. A giant mob of people said, "Beat it, Russia's that way." And then they sang a song about being free. And it was just way too many people to massacre, and the Soviets backed down and pulled their troops out. It worked. That really happened. And that's part of their training in the Baltics now for if they're ever invaded by Russia, again, how to defeat them with civil disobedience, essentially, because they'd be presumably overmatched militarily, but how to jam up the works without violence. And look, there's 195 countries in the world. So could Putin have found a neutral enough third-party country? So I don't know, India. Let's take 50,000 Indian troops and we'll just drop them in there on the border and have them stand there. Kiev wouldn't dare kill them. Now we have a de facto implemented ceasefire. Now we're going to hold elections. Now we're going to implement Minsk II, blah, 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 on down the thing. The other thing, and I really fault him for this, is he was playing coy the whole time and saying, well, look, I'd like you to slight my tree, but no, I'm not going to invade. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm not invading. And then they all look like the boy who cried wolf because they kept saying, oh, he's definitely going to do it on January the 16th. And then he didn't, and that kind of thing. When what he should have said was, you're damn right I'm going to invade. You got 3 weeks. I expect, real negotiations here, nothing less than that. And whatever. Why be cute? Why not go ahead and say, and I speculate in the book, perhaps military necessity required diplomatic incompetence, right? That they had to we got to make it a surprise attack. Like the Americans can't see every single thing they're doing from outer space anyway, And so he could have, instead of being coy, he could have played it tough and said, listen to me, humanity. I'm sick and tired of this. It's all America's fault. And here's why. And this is why, whatever. He could have done a better job convincing the other nation states to put pressure on the United States to be reasonable about the thing. Putin submitted a treaty, 2 treaties, one for NATO and one for the US, and they were essentially reasonable. Like you could say, look, no one would say, oh, you just go and sign on the dotted line and do whatever Russia demands, right? But as I point out in the book, they actually had the deputy foreign minister introduce the treaty, Rybakov, meaning he is below not just Putin, but he's also below Sergei Lavrov. In other words, when it comes to hey, I got to go talk to the boss, he can do that, right? Like this is a signal right there in the diplomatic language of just having not Lavrov, but the lower down guy issued the treaty in the first place is body language, is a diplomatic signal that this is negotiable. We can talk about this. And there were even Biden administration officials who told the Post and the Times that this is not entirely unreasonable. This is the basis for a potential new agreement. And I talked with Chas Freeman, who's, went to China with Nixon, was a career foreign service officer, former ambassador to Saudi Arabia. And he said, it's absolutely a reasonable treaty. It's absolutely the reasonable basis to sit down and begin negotiations. Doesn't mean that we do whatever they say, but it means that, yes, we could talk about this. But the Biden government's position was, we don't want peace here. Well, it was like this. Plan A was to just threaten Russia. You better not do it. We'll wage an economic war against you, and ultimately we will pour in weapons and help the Ukrainians resist you as long as we can, as long as they can. And then that was it. Plan B was go ahead and invade, and we're going to bog you down, and it'll be like Afghanistan in the 80s, and we'll support the Ukrainians against you. Lock the Russians into a long-term battle, as they told the New York Times. And that was it. So that should have been Plan C, maybe, if you accept even the premise of any of this intervention at all. But Plan B could and should have been our Secretary of State and their foreign minister lock themselves in a room for 8 hours and hammer this damn thing out, man. How can we have a hot war on Russia's very border? We're risking humanity from the Donbass. Can't be right. There's got to be a better way to handle this. And they didn't want to handle it. They preferred to have a war, as they put it over and over again, to weaken Russia, to strategically weaken Russia. And in fact, you might remember, if you go back 2.5 years, 3 years, all these fantasies about, we're going to break Putin. His government is going to fall. He's going to be driven from power. Madeleine Albright predicted he'd be driven from power. And I have a section on this on my book. They even start talking about decolonizing Russia. Let's break what's left of the Soviet Union, the Russian Federation. Let's break that into 15 more pieces. Like, that wouldn't cause a H-bomb war first. But that was the kind of imperial hubris and the ideas under which they're operating. And that's really what led to the war.
Well, so how much did Russiagate play into this whole thing? Because, they took Crimea in 2014. And as I always say on the show, like, I didn't see Ukraine flags in people's bios. I didn't see, Slava Ukraini in people's names and all that. People knew about it. Maybe they didn't like it, but we didn't care enough to do anything about it. But then we get Russiagate for years and years and years. How much did that play into the political will and power that the Biden administration had to spend all this money trying to support Ukraine?
It's probably impossible to calculate, right? I mean, Russiagate was like a H-bomb against American liberal Democrats' brains, and they're just wrecked by it, all of them. And, try to be sympathetic. I know it can be hard because it's such a ridiculous hoax, and my personal childish hatred of the people who perpetrated it is like, it's a little of a counter incentive for me personally to sympathize with the people who believed it. But I have to try. Like, what the hell? I had liberal women teach me in government school and whatever. I know them, right? Like, I know how they are. NPR listening, Ford Explorer driving ladies in their culture that they have there. And so, like, put yourself in their position. They were absolutely terrified. Donald Trump wasn't Donald Trump, the real estate tycoon and TV huckster that you've known your whole life. No, he's a fascist, Nazi, white supremacist dictator who's overthrowing America. He's going to replace the Department of Justice with neo-Nazi skinhead gangs of marauding Nazi murderers. And the only reason any of this is happening to us is because Moscow, the Kremlin, the Russians, Putin did a coup d'etat and usurped not just like Bill Clinton or Joe Biden, but Hillary Clinton's rightful throne. It was supposed to be her. And they were so wedded to that. And then it was stolen away by the racists and the Russians. And so, but then that meant what? He was the commander of America's national police forces, of our military forces, of our nuclear forces. And so he had ultimate power as president of the United States. And they were absolutely terrified of what he was going to do to America at the behest of his Russian masters, because that was how badly they believed in the whole thing. And so you know, there's comparable conspiracy theories on the right about the Democrats when they're in there or whatever, right? Like, remember when, I won't name names, but certain ridiculous, extremely wealthy hucksters convinced people about 11 years ago that the army was going to invade Texas and kill everybody and put us under martial law and lock us all in abandoned Walmarts and stuff. Because why? Because Barack Obama is the secret agent of the evil terrorist Muslim Illuminati, New World Order, blah, 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 is why he's going to wage war against Texas. But meanwhile, what were they doing? You remember what I'm talking about? It was called the Jade Palm, something like that, exercises. What were they doing?
That FEMA camp set up and everything, right?
They were practicing to re-invade Iraq. This was 2014, 2013. The Caliphate had just conquered Western Iraq. And so the army was practicing fighting ISIS. In where? In West Texas, where, you know, it's the desert. And they're like practicing helicopter maneuvers and whatever. But if you're caught up in a bunch of crap, then you could believe that, yes, Barack Obama is about to declare war on Texas and the army's going to help him do it. Be afraid, buy a water filter, move out to the country, right? Buy 2 water filters. Same thing for Russiagate here for liberal Democrat centrists, right? For the NPR crowd, right? For upper middle class liberal women. And they were all in on it. And even after the whole thing fell flat, none of their media admitted that, like, okay, we were really wrong about that. Instead, it was like, well, I don't know, whatever. Anyway, next issue, COVID or Ukraine or whatever. But there never was a reckoning. This reminds me of Iraq. There never was a reckoning where right-wingers said, you know what, we were really wrong about that, and we're really sorry. God, what fools we were to help George Bush put Iran's best friends in power in Baghdad and Osama bin Laden's best friends in power in Fallujah and Mosul. What are we, stupid or something? They never said that. It just kind of sort of went away. And they all remembered themselves as actually having opposed that war at the time. They didn't really think it was a good idea at all. And it just sort of went away. There never was a reckoning. There never was an admission and a come up, and certainly not on a broad kind of level all at one time, right? And same kind of thing with Russiagate. There was no admission that this whole thing was BS. And in fact, they pulled the same stunt in 2020. And even though it's a much more minimized story, the Hunter Biden laptop as Russian disinformation hoax, that was what? It was, again, Russia putting their thumb on the scale to rig an election for Donald Trump is what they claimed. So even though a year and a half before the whole thing had fallen flat with the Mueller report, now here it was just revived again. Now see, the Russians are again interfering in our election, trying to rig it for Donald Trump. Well, that was also a total hoax. That was also a complete lie. Now, but these are the same people going into just 1 year later, they're causing a war. And the whole Democratic Party consensus is that Vladimir Putin is Hitler. He's the absolute most dangerous threat in the world. As you said, everybody gets a Ukraine flag and a Nazi salute. Slava Ukraini is a Nazi salute. Founded, created by the Banderas who served Adolf Hitler. They started giving themselves stiff-arm Nazi salutes in court and chanting Slava Ukraini at each other when they were being tried for treason and murder. But anyway, they all got so caught up in the thing. There's this really interesting writer named John Robb with 2 B's, and he is a network analyst. He's a link analysis guy, a internet, computer security expert type, I guess. And the thing is, but he adapted his whole like computer network link analysis theory to human behavior. And he identifies what he calls the Twitter swarm. Now, this is pre-Musk Twitter, when it's totally PC, baby blue, Democrat Party Twitter. And he talks about the Twitter swarm and how they get themselves into this frenzy. It's not the top down, Peter Jennings told you what to think on the nightly news thing anymore. Now it's this peer-to-peer kind of deal. And they could be right or wrong, but it's very much resembles like this sort of insane, chaotic, leaderless, fad type movements. They come and they go so quickly. And he talks about how at the beginning of the Ukraine war, the Twitter swarm itself got way out ahead of Biden and helped to preclude the possibility of negotiations, because they had decided the consensus that the holy poly had built themselves, however you say that, like the Democratic Party rank and file out there had convinced themselves that this is Hitler and you can never back down to Hitler, and all of these narratives, in a way that even precluded diplomacy on the part of the Democrats in power if they had wanted to. They helped drive the narrative so hard that you can't negotiate with Sauron, who's sending his forces, his orcs, from Mordor, the land of darkness, to sack Minas Tirith. You must stand and you must fight. And that's how they portrayed the thing, is in those kinds of terms. And it really helped take people's, minds away. And so, yeah, I mean, Russiagate, remember, for people who were too young, or you just trauma-based blocked it out because you can't stand to think about it anymore, or maybe you were one of the damn fools who believed in it or something, but go back. This went on for 3 years. It started in June and July of 16. It ended in May, or was it April of 19? It was just shy of 3 full years of this absolute insanity. The people who had been inculcated on it, the disappointment at the end, the fizzle out at the end, it never really could erase what they had, quote unquote, learned. You know what I mean? It's like riding a bike or riding a skateboard or whatever. You know how to do it. You learned it already. You've been through it. You practiced being an anti-Russia conspiracy nut for 3 years. Now they've got a new one for you. And so, like, all right, the same way they readily accepted the Hunter Biden laptop thing. They didn't go, well, wait a minute. You guys lied about the last 100 claims you made about Trump and Russia. Why in the hell would we believe this? They didn't. They go, aha, see, it is all true after all. They had one FBI agent in New York who was busted on taking a bribe from a Russian oligarch who was like tangentially related to this thing, only in rumor. He didn't even really do anything. And immediately all the kooks went, aha, see, we knew it. This one FBI agent in New York, he's the one who ruined everything. If it wasn't for him, we'd have found out the truth about Russia's secret control of Trump. And they just get right back in that mindset. Now, think about if Trump hadn't won and it had just been Hillary, and somehow she hadn't got us into a war with Russia in 4 years, and then whatever, she died of a heart attack and Biden came in, and we had Biden in 21, but without any of the Russiagate hoax. Right. And they hadn't even tried, let's just say in our hypothetical, they hadn't even tried it in the summer of 16 against Trump. It just hadn't been an issue. Then could Biden have built up the hype that he did and the demonization of Putin that he did in order to preclude, any reasonable attempt at negotiation and effort to prevent the war? I don't know. I mean, it's an open question. It's a counterfactual. It's difficult to say, but you could see how in our reality, all of that hype and all of that tension certainly helped to prejudice the entire American political left. And I mean the liberal Democrats and the progressives and everybody, just helped absolutely poison them against the idea of negotiating in good faith with Russia and getting along with Russia.
What's sickening about that is that
negotiating with China or something, because China hadn't done all this to us recently, regardless of how untrue it all was,
What's sick about that is that so many people ended up dying in Ukraine, and Russians ended up dying when at the end of all this, maybe Trump negotiates and we get what we could have had at the beginning of this whole thing, only with a lot of dead people and a lot of money that went through that as well. And that's what we gained.
That's the story of this whole thing. In the book, I talk about the war in Bosnia, where everybody agrees that the Dayton Accord is a lot like the Lisbon Accord, only with an extra 100,000 people rotting in shallow graves. 2 years later, we could have had the same damn deal then. It happens over and over in the book where you have, and this is surprising to me, actually, to see how often the Americans will intervene at the last minute. In fact, there was a deal to implement the Minsk II peace deal during the Trump years, and Trump's ambassador, William Taylor, came in and said, no, don't sign that, and stopped them from doing it. just like Zimmerman in Bosnia. Did the same thing again. And that was in the Trump years. And I don't know what Trump was even in on that. He probably wasn't. You know, there's an article in the New York Times called The Quiet Americans. It's by Keith Gesson, who does some pretty good work. It's called The Quiet Americans. And in there, it's almost certain it's one of Trump's guys from his own administration says, Trump is like the captain of a ship. He's holding the wheel, but it's not attached to anything. And he can sit there and spin it and pretend he's driving, but he's just not in charge of his Russia policy at all. And we could definitely see that in Ukrainegate, son of Russiagate there, the way they impeached him. And according to the whistleblower, Vindman, it wasn't really Charamella. Vindman really was the guy who got the whole thing going. And according to his congressional testimony in the impeachment and his article in The Atlantic, you can read it, it's absolutely clear that Trump's impeachable offense was trying to change America's Russia-Ukraine policy. That was what he did. And Vindman is just outraged. Who the hell does this guy, Trump, think he is? Just because he won an election and gets to sit in that chair behind that desk, he thinks he gets to tell me what to do? Doesn't he know I'm a lieutenant colonel on the National Security Council and a Ukrainian American? And me and my friends in the interagency, we've decided what America's Russia policy is. We have a Russia policy. Who in the hell does the elected president of the United States of America think he is to change it? He has no right, and we'll impeach him first, says Vindman. Now, that's 100% Trump's fault for allowing John Brennan to place Ukrainian American traitor spies on his National Security Council. They're right down the hall. He's too busy watching blonde ladies cry about him on CNN all day to actually do his job and make sure he doesn't have traitors sitting on his own National Security Council 3 doors down from the Oval Office. So he's hoisted by his own petard there, man. You hire a bunch of horrible hawks who hate your guts. They're going to hire a bunch of horrible hawks who hate your guts too, dude. That's who your National Security Council is going to be made of. Enemies chosen for you by your enemies. So, yeah, we can look forward to another 4 years of that, I guess.
Well, so something about Trump, and what I want to do here is maybe a few rapid fire things, because I told you beforehand, I got some questions from the Fed Haters Club that I told them I'd try and get you to answer. We got like 15 minutes right now. So here's a question that I'll sneak one in. I've wanted to hear you answer for a bit. Is Trump an anti-war president, or at least a relatively anti-war president? How do you consider him on that front?
He's good on Russia. He wants peace with Russia. I don't know exactly what he's going to get. If he can strike a deal, I don't know exactly what's going to happen. The Russians are in a position of strength, not the Americans, and that's going to be difficult for Trump. And he's got a bunch of kooks running his government. Although the good news here is he's already announced that Marco Rubio is not in charge of this. He's announced that General Kellogg will be his special envoy to solve this. And I'll give Trump credit and I don't know how he did this. No one, I don't think, has ever reported the anecdote about what happened in the room. But Trump got Zalmay Khalilzad, the card-carrying real-ass neoconservative, to swear to him that he really means it and is not lying, that he will negotiate an exit from Afghanistan with the Taliban. Freeze out Kabul. Kabul doesn't have a say. We're going to deal directly with the Taliban, and we are going to leave. And Khalilzad, don't you string me along now. Sign this deal. Blood oath swear. And somehow he got Khalilzad to agree to that. If he's willing to behave that same way and tell General Kellogg, look, man, the parameters are no NATO membership, and I don't care where the damn boundary is and whatever. Figure it out. Get the thing done now, not later. And Kellogg promises that he really means it, that they're going to do it. I think they can do it. This is an unnecessary war. I don't think it can be reversed. I think the Russians are going to at least hold the territory they've got. If not, they may still demand the entirety of the provinces that they claim but don't wholly control yet. I don't know exactly. And then look, I think, we saw his instincts on North Korea was he wanted to make friends with Kim. His own government, again, prevented him from doing that. I think there's a very good chance that he can make a deal with North Korea now. They cry. I don't think this is proven, but they say that the North Koreans have troops fighting in Russia now against Ukrainian forces in Kursk. I don't think anybody's really demonstrated that, but clearly North Korea and Russia are closer than ever before. But whose fault is that? The Democrats, who did everything they could to sabotage Trump when he was trying to make peace with Kim in his last term. And if he had made peace with Kim then, Kim would not do anything to jeopardize his new relationship with the United States by cozying up to Russia. But the Democrats did everything they could to sabotage Trump, and the War Party, his own, again, hired enemies like John Bolton, helped to prevent that from being seen through. But you could see the potential there for a permanent peace in Korea, which would be one of the greatest inventions in mankind. I mean, that's a really dangerous country sitting on a pile of atomic bombs, some of them potentially boosted or even full H bombs. And they have missile power to reach the United States now. So that's a problem that truly needs solving. But then the rub, and the audience all knows the rub, is that Donald Trump, he was never a Russian agent. He's an Israeli agent. He is a servant of Benjamin Netanyahu, just like his son-in-law, who is Benjamin Netanyahu's godson, whose bed he slept in when he came to visit New York. Donald Trump caused October the 7th. Donald Trump's absolutely idiotic Middle East policy for 4 years said, let Netanyahu do whatever he wants. He wants to murder these people and steal their property. He wants American tax money to bribe all the Sunni kings to look away and forsake the Palestinians and sign these stupid Abraham Accords. Then fine, you can have all of the American people's tax money you want, Bahrain and UAE and Sudan, to recognize and normalize relations with Israel. And then Netanyahu got up there and he gave a speech at the end of September of 22, where he held up a map of what he called the new Middle East. And there's no West Bank or Gaza Strip on there. It's all Israel. And he says, see, this is the new Middle East. I got away with it. Hey, Palestinians, no one's coming for you. Not even rhetorically anymore. Ha ha. No citizenship for you. No independence for you. You're my slaves. I have destroyed you and defeated you. You can lay down on your bellies and cry about it. You can kill yourselves if you want, but you have been ultimately and completely and totally defeated. And he might as well have threatened to blow up the Al-Aqsa Mosque and rebuild the Third Temple. At that point, he declared total victory. Well, 2 weeks later, Hamas broke out of their pen and slaughtered a bunch of Israelis and proved that, no, actually, this fight isn't over yet, not by a long shot. And that was a direct result of Donald Trump telling Sheldon Adelson, thank you for the money. I have cashed your check. Now you have purchased me and I'm your private property and I'll do whatever you say. You want me to move the embassy to Jerusalem? I'll move the embassy to Jerusalem. You want me to recognize Israel's seizure of the Golan Heights? I'll recognize Israel's seizure of the Golan Heights. You want me to spend American billions bribing the Sunni kings to recognize Israel? Fine, I'll do that too. You want me to go ahead and murder every last Palestinian myself? Give me a knife. And so then now what do we expect? Sheldon Adelson died. But guess what? He was only an agent of his wife, Miriam Adelson, who is actually an Israeli, who, I love this. This is American Christian conservatives take their orders from an Israeli heiress of a Chinese communist gambling fortune. This guy, Sheldon Adelson, made all his money on gambling in Macau. And now his Israeli wife writes checks to Donald Trump for $100 million. And she owns his soul. And he is her slave, and he will behave like her slave for the next 4 years. What's he going to do? Say, actually, Israel, you can go screw yourself. Is that what he's going to do? No. What does he say every time this comes up? He goes, any Jew who doesn't vote Republican is a traitor to Israel. Like Jews in America owe the slightest bit of allegiance to Israel. What? He is just such a kook, and he might as well be Likud, and I wouldn't be surprised if he names Benjamin Netanyahu to be the prime minister of the U.S. Senate. I wouldn't be surprised if he gives him an aircraft carrier and a fleet of destroyers and heavy bombers. Why not? Why wouldn't he? Why wouldn't he get down on his knees and bark like a dog for Benjamin Netanyahu? You tell me.
Given that, I'm starting to go back on thinking that he's an anti-war president because seems to be a lot of war going on in that part of the world. And I don't I don't know if he's going to have the willpower to stop it. Now we got the thing in Syria going on, and I mean, of course, Israel doesn't want the wrong people taking over Syria. That'd be very dangerous for them. And
no, they do. No, they were insistent on making sure the wrong people take over Syria. That's what just happened. Right? They were the ones who helped Al-Qaeda just conquer the secular Baathist government there. Imagine if Saddam Hussein in 2003 had been in the middle of putting down an Al-Qaeda-backed insurrection, and then George Bush chose that time to overthrow him when he's right in the middle of fighting against Al-Qaeda. That's what America just did, and America and Israel and Turkey just did in Syria.
So I got a couple more in here that I told people I would get to, and as we're kind of running out of time, Josh wants to know if we've overused the label neocon and destroyed its meaning, like we destroyed Nazis or racists or whatever. Who would you consider to be the current, actual, real neocons that fit the true definition? Great question. Yeah, who are those people?
It's very few. I would suggest people go to the Militarist Monitor website put together by Peter Serto. It's really great, and it used to be called Right Web, and there are some extraneous right-wingers on there, but it's mostly focused on the neoconservative movement, and it has in-depth profiles, of the neoconservative think tanks and groups and the actual members of the neoconservative movement. And the questioner is absolutely right. The word neocon does not mean conservatives nowadays, and it doesn't mean a hawk. The neoconservatives is a group of men and women, mostly men, and probably not more than 100 of them. I don't know if anybody ever counted like an actual head count of all of them. We're on like the third or fourth generation now, but essentially these are the children and intellectual and literal children of Irving Kristol and Norman Podhoretz, Leo Strauss and Albert Wohlstetter and Max Schachmann, and for that matter, Hook and Burnham and others from the National Review. And these guys were all ex-Trotskyites who then moved to the right. And they moved to the right for Israel and against civil rights, and sort of, you think about the hippie era, the late 60s, right? Like 60s era woke. They moved to the right in reaction to that. And because the new left in America sided against Israel in the 67 war. And so they moved to the Republican Party, and they became deputy undersecretary of something you never heard of in the Reagan administration, mostly. And then these are the men that W. Bush and Dick Cheney hired en masse, who took us to war in Iraq in 2003. So about half of them are, media guys and think tank guys, and the other half of them serve in Republican administrations. In the Trump administration, the last Trump administration, I believe the only literal neoconservative that he employed was Elliot Abrams, who of course helped to cook up the failed coup in Venezuela. John Bolton is often identified as one, but incorrectly. He is a lifelong Barry Goldwater right-wing conservative nationalist, never a leftist of any kind, and although very close to that set. And so I would recommend people can watch a great speech by Jim Loeb called Neoconservatism in a Nutshell, where he explains all of this very well. There's another fun article by him called All in the Neocon Family, where he talks about like Midge Decter's Thanksgiving table and how it's all of the worst neocons, including Victoria Nuland, Robert Kagan's wife, and all of these people, and the Abramses and the Crystals and the whoever's, they're all intermarried, and it's all just this horrible little mess. And then, search this up. Okay, type my name, Scott Horton Show on Twitter, and then 28 articles. The numbers, the digits, 28 articles. And then it's actually like 34 or whatever, because I kept adding more and more and more. It's a long, long, long list of articles, all of the best articles about how the neoconservatives lied us into the war with Iraq in 2002 and 3. And it's really as comprehensive, as best a list as I could possibly do for you there. I think you'll all get a lot out of it.
All right. One more minute here. This is just about you. And so this should be real easy to answer here. What's it like to write a book? Have you had training? Did you set out to write this book? And what's your favorite book that you've done?
That's interesting. So no, I'm not really a natural born talented writer. I'm really a radio guy. who reads other people's writing. But what happened was, I guess, originally Tom Woods said to me, let's do a book, A War on Terrorism for Dummies. And I said, oh, I can do that. So while he was at lunch, I wrote the outline. Here's what it'll say. And then I just started working on it. And then what happened was chapter 2 turned into Fool's Errand, my first book about Afghanistan, because I just couldn't wrap it up. Once I got to the torture section, that was like 25,000 words or something, whatever it was. And I was like, well, this isn't going to fit in the chapter here. What am I doing now? And then it turned out there's just so much more to say about Afghanistan. It just kept going. And so chapter 2 became Afghanistan. And then Enough Already is kind of a cheat, because Enough Already is actually that same outline I'd written for Tom. A friend of mine turned it into a PowerPoint presentation. And then I did a speech based off the PowerPoint presentation for like 5 hours, this giant thing for Renegade University. And then my friend Joanne, the Australian, transcribed it all for me, which is amazing.
Okay.
And that became Enough Already. And so then I just went through the transcript of the lecture I gave based off the PowerPoint that was made off of my outline of the book that I wished I had written in the first place. And so then I just had to go in and edit it and tighten it up and fill it in with more facts and whatever kind of thing. So that's not any method that I would recommend that anyone try, but it happened to work for Enough Already. And then for Provoked, as anyone can tell, if you can see it behind me on the shelf there, the girth of the dang thing, I got a bit carried away. Once I blew past my page limit of 300 pages, and I knew I wasn't anywhere near done. And then 400 and 500 and 600 and like, okay, I don't know. I guess I just decided at some point, I'm just going to keep writing until I'm done. And then I'm going to have to go back and figure out how to zip it down as best I can, which I never did figure out. So I cut out all the block quotes. I cut them down to smaller quotes for space, and edit out as much extraneous stuff as I could. But I really couldn't figure out what to leave out.
Well, speaking of, for me, like, is that going to be audio also?
I'm sorry?
Is that going to be audio version also? Because like I'm really bad at reading books, so I'm wondering for me.
Yeah. Well, I tell you, I've been doing so many interviews lately. It's been really hard for me to find the time to do it. But I've already done with, I'm already finished with H.W. Bush, and I'm about halfway through Bill Clinton. So I got to wait for my buddy to get them all mastered up and whatever. And then that's going to be a Substack podcast series, because it's going to be so long. It's going to have to be in parts. And that'll be at scotthortonshow.com. That's my Substack page. If people want to subscribe to that, it's going to be a Substack series, like a Martyr Made style series first. And then it will be, I will eventually publish it as a single Audible audiobook when I'm done.
All right. So thanks to Clark for that one. Jake wants to know when you're going to run for president on the LP ticket, and that's the last one.
I'm never going to do that. I promise to make myself available to help advise almost any presidential candidate that we run. I probably wouldn't mess with the last guy too much, but I promise to tell them all what to say if they ask me. Mm-hmm. But I don't think I'm the right guy to stand up there.
No? All right.
No.
All right. Well, Scott, thank you so much for your time. I mean, just we barely scratched the surface. I actually am not even sure we scratched the surface in this, but I recommend.
Everybody's just going to have to read the whole thing.
Yeah, everyone's got to read all the books for sure. Go find it. I ordered it, by the way. It's a gigantic book. Okay, but it's already wrapped up for a gift for someone in my family, but it's massive, very big book. So I recommend everyone go and grab that. You've done thousands of interviews, so there's no shortage of content to go out there and listen to all of your stuff. And where else can everyone go to find all your things?
Yeah. Well, I'm the director of the Libertarian Institute. We got a ton of great writers and podcasters and all the best that the Libertarian movement has to offer there at the libertarianinstitute.org. And then scotthorton.org for my show. As you said, I got 6,000 interviews going back to 2003 there, scotthorton.org, and all the video sites, YouTube and Rumble and whatever, /Scott Horton Show, Scott Horton Show on Twitter. And yeah, I guess that's about it.
All right. Scott, thank you so much for
antiwar.com, of course.
Yeah, of course.
That's the most important project on the internet. How could I forget?
Thank you so much for your time today, Scott.
Thank you. Appreciate you having me.